So you're a beginning photographer, you buy a new camera, you flip that switch to auto, you start taking pictures, everything's going great. But then where do you go from there? Please excuse my long, mangy, gross hair. There's no barbershops open due to this pandemic going on, so this is just what we're gonna have to deal with. So today we're gonna be talking about 5 different things that I think that every beginning photographer needs to know and understand in order to fully utilize their camera and get the best quality out of it possible. These are things that are really basic functions of a camera, but in order to really express yourself creatively, you need to know how to shift and change these to complement your creative style. One way that I like to describe these things is just kind of like as a balance beam of elements, and you have to be able to use them all collectively together in order to achieve whatever you're looking for. If you're only able to understand and use a certain amount of these skills, then your composition, you won't be able to use it to your maximum potential. Take it as you will, but utilizing all 5 of these things is going to be able to boost your photo game, boost your video game, help you understand your camera better. So number 1, I think the easiest thing to understand and comprehend about your camera is the shutter speed. Now the shutter speed is arguably one of the most important things depending on what kind of photography you're going for. If you're using a DSLR camera, your shutter speed is going to be that thing that opens and closes to allow light in. And depending on how fast you let that shutter open and close is going to allow how much motion blur you want in your picture. So if you're a sports photographer, having that shutter open for really long, or even just an 1/8 of a second, you're not going to get that nice crisp picture that you want. You're going to have a little bit of motion blur and it's just not going to look as good. However, if you're going for something like long exposure photography, you're able to bend light and you're able to use that light element as something in your photography. Having that shutter open for longer to allow more light in is going to be something that's going to benefit you. Whereas a fast shutter is going to be really fast. It's going to open and close maybe like 1/100th of a second, but it's going to allow for no motion blur in that image, and you're going to get that really crisp image that you'll see in like sports newspapers of like football players in action catching the ball mid-air, just super crisp. It's just frozen. But the only way that you're going to get that is by allowing that shutter to open and close really fast to freeze that image in time. Number 2 is going to be your aperture. Your aperture is what's inside of your camera lens that's going to open and close to allow a certain amount of light in. So that's why you'll hear some people call lenses faster, because they allow more light in, which allows you to open and close your shutter faster. The more light that's coming in, the faster you can open and close your shutter without having an underexposed image. If you've ever looked at buying lenses, that's why a certain lens with the same focal range, let's say a 24-70 and a 24-105, they're about the same focal range. But one, the 24-105 has an f4 and the 24-70 has an f2.8. Same focal range and exactly almost the same lens, but the f4 lens is significantly less expensive than the f2.8 lens, and that f number is representing your aperture. So 2.8 allows your aperture to open up super wide, and the f4, it allows you to open wide but not as wide as the 2.8. That's why the f2.8 lenses are so expensive. Now the reason why these f2.8 lenses are so expensive is because that aperture being super wide is what allows you to have that nice blurry background you see in portrait pictures. Everybody is obsessed with this blurry background that we call bokeh. Now your bokeh effect is going to allow you to have that nice crisp image of the subject while keeping the background super smooth and blurry. Having aperture control is probably one of the most beneficial things to having a nice mirrorless or DSLR camera. So on things such as like your iPhone, even though these cameras are amazing, they don't let you control the aperture, and so typically everything in the photo is going to be in focus. Number 3 is going to be your ISO. Now what is ISO? Your ISO is a representation of the amount of fake light that your camera uses to produce the image. So in other words, if the environment you're in is significantly low on light, you can crank up that ISO to give your image more light or more brightness. But the only downside of this is that the more fake light you give it, the more grain you're gonna have in your image. Now some people like that grain and it can be used a lot of the time for artistic purposes, but most of the time if you want that nice sharp image, you have to keep your ISO as low as possible. So using that ISO in the right situations in the right way is gonna help you to properly expose your image without adding too much grain, or in other cases using grain if you want it. You can turn your shutter speed super low to get that underexposed image while cranking your ISO higher to give your image more grain quality, but most of the time you're going to want to keep your ISO as low as possible. So moving on to number 4 is your composure. This is probably the most important thing to understand as a new photographer. So there are a lot of different schools of thought when it comes to composing an image properly, but the two that you'll hear most often are the rule of thirds and leading lines. Now the rule of thirds is something that's so commonly used that it's integrated into iPhone settings, it's on every camera, you can set it programmed to basically anything, and the concept behind it is that your screen is divided into a grid of 9 different rectangles, and those 9 different rectangles are going to give you 4 intersecting crosses. Now those 4 intersecting crosses are what you're going to use to create a more dynamic photo. By putting the main subject of the photo in one of those areas of the frame, you're going to get a more interesting and dynamic photo, as opposed to just having the image front and center, squared with camera, nothing interesting, just straightforward, point and shoot, done. While that can be used in some cases, most of the time having the subject off to the side just a little bit is going to be more pleasing to the eye, and it's going to create just an overall more interesting photo. Now leading lines are something that you can use to draw the attention of the audience to something in the picture. A lot of the time this can be used with parallel lines leading away from the camera to a subject. One interesting way that I've seen leading lines being used is using the ridge of mountaintops to kind of draw the eye at an angle towards something in the picture. If you use this properly, you can create a very satisfying image for somebody to look at. Having super symmetrical parallel lines drawing your eyes towards something, it's another way to create a lot of interest and spice up the composure of your image. 3 other things to consider when you're coming up with your composure is the foreground and the background, as well as the lighting. Now lighting is something that's incredibly important when it comes to photography, and mastering lighting is something that takes a long time and a lot of practice. But there's different lighting scenarios and different lighting methods that you can use to implement into your lighting, and just play around with it, see what you can come up with. And at the end of the day, whatever you come up with and whatever you use is based on your own artistic preference and your creative vision. But nonetheless, lighting is what creates drama in a photo. It creates intensity. Lighting is one of those things that evokes emotion in your audience, and being able to utilize that properly is going to lead to a better composure. One key thing that I like to use in a lot of my photography is by putting something in the foreground. And what that means is having something in the frame of the camera but not in focus in front of the subject. So if I'm shooting somebody, I'll have something in front of them. I'll have like leaves or something. If I'm out in the middle of nowhere, I'll have like a tree branch or leaves or something in front of their face that is out of focus but gives the photo a lot more dynamic range. So for example, if I took something like this glass right here and I just held it in front of the lens. Now I know this is super awkward, but like imagine this as a photo. I'll take 2 stills. Now just adding something like that, something super small in front of the lens, creates a lot of dynamic variability in your image. Being able to use that is just going to be able to create a lot more interesting photos. It's something really simple, something really easy to use, but it's invaluable. Just by putting something in front of the lens, it creates depth of field in your photo. It just gives your photo a more interesting feeling. And lastly, the thing we're going to talk about is framing. Now framing is something that's used a lot by photographers in order to help focus on the subject. By using things in your environment around you to help frame your subject is a great way of drawing the attention to whatever you want to do, whether or not it's in the center of the frame, whether or not it's in one of the corners of the rule of thirds. No matter what you're trying to do, framing the subject is just going to result in a more pleasing image, and it's just going to move the story along. It's going to help tell the story, increase the quality of the image. There are a couple of different ways that you can use this. A lot of the time what I'll do is, if I'm shooting through a tree, I'll use the branches up above and down below with some leaves, and I'll shoot through a hole in it right at the subject to help focus on where they are. Just use whatever's around you in your environment to help create a virtual frame for your subject. And you can use things like the foreground, the concept of foreground, to make sure that that frame is out of focus, and make sure that your subject is really crisp and clear, to make sure that they're the real focus of that image. So that's going to be it for my 5 tips for beginning photographers. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys next week. Can I help you?
Are you recording?
Mm-hmm.
They can't hear me.
Probably not. The mic's right here.